On the morning of November 13th, 2022, the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, awoke to a nightmare. Tucked into a hillside at 1122 King Road, a three-story rental house often filled with the laughter of students became the scene of one of the most haunting crimes in modern American history. The story of the Idaho Four begins with a discovery that shook an entire town, but it's only the first step in uncovering the truth. To follow every detail as we dive deeper into this case, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Inside were four young lives: Madison Maddie Mogen, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. They were students at the University of Idaho, friends who lived and studied in a small town where violent crime was virtually unheard of. That Sunday morning, two surviving roommates called friends to the house after discovering something was terribly wrong. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was made from inside. What officers found when they arrived shook them to their core. All four students had been brutally stabbed to death in the middle of the night. The attack was carried out with a large knife, leaving behind a scene described by police as one of the most violent they had ever encountered. There were no signs of forced entry. The home itself, a familiar off-campus party spot among students, showed no immediate explanation for the horror inside. The victims had lived an ordinary Saturday just hours earlier. Madison and Kaylee spent the evening at a downtown Moscow bar called Corner Club, before grabbing food at a food truck where they were spotted smiling and chatting on livestream footage. Xana and Ethan, who was visiting his girlfriend, had been at a fraternity party earlier that night before returning home around 1:45 a.m. By sunrise, all four were dead. For a small town of fewer than 26,000 residents, the murders were unthinkable. Students locked their doors. Parents pulled their children out of classes. The University of Idaho canceled events. Law enforcement launched a desperate search for answers, but the crime scene, chaotic, bloody, and sprawling across multiple floors of the house, presented as many questions as it did clues. Detectives scoured the King Road residence, documenting every room, every item, every trace of evidence. One detail, however, stood out: a tan leather knife sheath found on the bed near Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves. On its button snap, investigators collected a single male DNA sample. It was a small lead, but in the early days it meant little without a name to match it to. The murders quickly drew national attention. Cable news descended on Moscow. Social media lit up with theories, rumors, and speculation. With no suspects named and no murder weapon recovered, fear spread across campus. Students asked if a killer was still on the loose. Parents demanded answers. In the middle of it all were the victims' families, thrust into a spotlight they never wanted, grieving children whose lives had been cut short in the most violent way imaginable. At that moment, there was no Bryan Kohberger, no arrest, no plea deal, only shock, grief, and fear, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, a killer had walked free into the night. When a case begins with no suspect, no weapon, and no clear motive, do you think investigators should share more with the public or hold back details to protect the case? Before the headlines, before the trial, before Bryan Kohberger's name was ever connected to their tragedy, there were four students living ordinary college lives in Moscow, Idaho. To understand the magnitude of what was stolen on November 13th, 2022, we have to first remember who they were. Madison Maddie Mogen, 21, was the kind of friend who lit up every room she entered. Blonde, bubbly, and fiercely loyal, Maddie was studying marketing at the University of Idaho. She shared a bond with Kaylee Goncalves that went back to childhood. The two had grown up together in northern Idaho and were inseparable, almost like sisters. Friends said they finished each other's sentences, shared the same sense of humor, and dreamed of exploring the world beyond their small-town roots. Maddie worked at a Greek restaurant in Moscow, often seen laughing with customers, her smile a reflection of her upbeat spirit. Kaylee Goncalves, 21, was known for her determination and independence. She was majoring in general studies, with plans to move to Texas for a new job in technology after graduation. Kaylee had recently adopted a golden doodle puppy named Murphy, who became a source of comfort and joy during her final months. Those closest to her said Kaylee was adventurous, unafraid to speak her mind, and deeply protective of the people she loved. Her friendship with Maddie was legendary on campus, a bond that would ultimately bring them together on the night they lost their lives. Xana Kernodle, 20, was a junior majoring in marketing. Like Maddie, described as free-spirited and warm, she was known for her laugh that seemed to draw people in. Xana had grown up in Idaho and Washington, and she valued her close relationships with her family. At the time of her death, she was in a committed relationship with Ethan Chapin, and the two were rarely seen apart. Xana's roommates described her as strong-willed and independent, the kind of person who stood up for herself but always had time for others. Ethan Chapin, 20, was a triplet, one of 3 siblings who were all students at the University of Idaho. Ethan was majoring in recreation, sport, and tourism management. He was tall, athletic, and always smiling, often described as the gentle giant of his circle of friends. Ethan played intramural sports and was active in his fraternity. Sigma Chi, his relationship with Xana Kernodle was loving and steady, a partnership that gave both of them joy during the challenges of college life. Together, Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan represented what college is supposed to be: friendship, love, ambition, and the pursuit of a future filled with possibility. They were the heartbeat of the house at 1122 King Road, where their nights were filled with laughter, shared meals, and late-night conversations. On the evening of November 12, 2022, they were simply being young adults. Madison and Kaylee spent the night downtown, Xana and Ethan at a fraternity party. They returned home in the early morning hours, unaware that danger was already close. By the next morning, their names would be spoken together in grief, forever tied by the violence that ended their lives. And though investigators would soon focus on a suspect named Bryan Kohberger, the first question everyone asked was not who, but why. Do you think remembering the victims' lives, their dreams, their friendships, their families, is just as important as uncovering the details of how they died? Saturday, November 12, 2022, began like countless other weekends in Moscow, Idaho. The University of Idaho campus buzzed with the usual energy of college life. Football games, fraternity parties, students crowding the downtown bars. For 4 young friends living in the off-campus house at 1122 King Road, it was supposed to be just another night. Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves, lifelong best friends, decided to go out downtown. They spent several hours at the Corner Club, a popular student bar where they laughed and talked with friends. Later, around 1:30 a.m., they stopped at the Grub Truck, a local food vendor whose live stream camera inadvertently captured their final carefree moments alive. The footage showed Madison and Kaylee smiling, waiting for their order, and then leaving with a man who was later cleared by police as unrelated to the murders. By 1:56 a.m., they had returned to King Road. At the same time, Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, were at a Sigma Chi fraternity party just a short walk away. They left the house around 9 p.m. and returned to Xana's residence on King Road shortly before 2 a.m. Investigators would later confirm they used a food delivery service that dropped off an order at the house at approximately 4 a.m. 2 other roommates, who lived on the ground floor, had also been out that evening but were home by the time the night reached its darkest hours. Between 4 o'clock and 4:25 a.m., the timeline turned horrific. Investigators believe this was the window when Bryan Kohberger entered the King Road home. The surviving roommates later told police they heard noises. One thought she heard crying from Xana's room. Another thought Kaylee had said something like, "There's someone here." A security camera from a nearby property picked up sounds of a dog barking and faint thuds around 4:17 a.m. It was Murphy, Kaylee's golden doodle, locked in her room during the killings. Inside the house, investigators believe the attacker moved swiftly, carrying out the stabbings with a large fixed-blade knife. Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were killed together in the 3rd-floor bedroom, found in the same bed. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were killed on the 2nd floor. The coroner later confirmed all 4 victims suffered multiple stab wounds, some defensive, suggesting they tried to fight back. By 4:25 a.m., the house was silent. The killer slipped away into the night. For hours, the house sat still, its surviving roommates unaware of the full scope of the nightmare upstairs. It wasn't until nearly noon that the police were called. By then, the killer was gone, and for promising lives had been extinguished in the span of minutes. When news broke, shock spread across Moscow. Parents rushed to pick up their children. Students barricaded themselves inside dorms and apartments. Rumors swirled about stalkers, targeted victims, and unknown suspects. Fear gripped the town. At that point, no one could imagine that the man responsible lived just 10 miles away, a criminology student named Bryan Kohberger, quietly studying the very subject he had turned into a real-life horror. Do you believe the attack was premeditated and targeted? Or was it an impulsive act of violence by Bryan Kohberger? When the bodies of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were discovered on November 13, 2022, Moscow, Idaho, was thrust into a nightmare that no one was prepared for. The crime scene at 1122 King Road was so violent that seasoned investigators described it as one of the most disturbing they had ever encountered. But the immediate aftermath was defined less by answers and more by chaos. At first, police were reluctant to reveal details. They confirmed students were dead, but gave no information about suspects, motives, or how the killer had entered the home. Parents called in panic, demanding to know if their children were safe. Some packed bags and pulled their kids out of campus housing, unwilling to wait for clarity. In those first days, rumors filled the silence. On social media, theories spread like wildfire. Was the killer a stalker targeting Kaylee? Was it someone connected to a fraternity party? Some speculated the murders were random, the work of a drifter who had slipped into town unnoticed. Meanwhile, the University of Idaho struggled to restore calm. Administrators urged students to stay vigilant, lock their doors, and travel in pairs. But those reassurances meant little in a community that had never faced such brutality. For many, the sight of patrol cars circling campus and helicopters overhead only deepened the fear. Investigators faced immense pressure. Dozens of state and federal agents descended on Moscow, combing through every inch of the house, collecting fingerprints, DNA, and thousands of photographs. They interviewed friends, classmates, and neighbors. Still, days turned into weeks, and the public grew restless. A crucial piece of evidence, the knife sheath left beside Madison and Kaylee, had already been collected, but at the time, police did not release this information. Instead, they reassured the public that the murders appeared targeted. Yet the statement only raised more questions. If targeted, then who was the intended victim? And why? The families of the victims voiced their frustration. They held vigils, demanding transparency. Kaylee Goncalves' parents, in particular, spoke out, criticizing the slow trickle of information. They wanted answers, not reassurances. By Thanksgiving, the case had drawn national media attention. Cable news trucks parked outside Moscow. True crime podcasts analyzed every detail. Strangers on the internet speculated endlessly about who the killer might be. And through it all, the police remained tight-lipped, urging patience while working behind the scenes to connect the dots. Unbeknownst to the public, one lead was already changing the direction of the case. That knife sheath with its trace of male DNA had been sent to a lab. It would become the thread that unraveled the mystery and pointed investigators toward a name no one expected: Bryan Kohberger. Do you think investigators were right to withhold key evidence in those early days? Or did the lack of information make the community's fear even worse? The chaos after the murders was only the beginning. To follow how investigators went from dead ends to a suspect in custody, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell, so you don't miss where we uncover how a single piece of DNA evidence on a knife sheath broke the case wide open. Among the chaos inside 1122 King Road, where 4 University of Idaho students, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, had been murdered, investigators discovered something that seemed almost out of place. On the bed where Madison and Kaylee were found together, there was a tan leather knife sheath, partially tucked under the blankets. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary piece of gear, the kind you'd expect to find in a hunter's home. But to detectives, it was more than just a sheath. It was a potential clue to the weapon that had taken 4 lives. Forensic specialists handled it with care. Under bright laboratory lights, they examined every seam, every surface. And then, on the button snap of the sheath, they found what would become the breakthrough. A single sample of male DNA. It wasn't much, a trace, almost invisible. But it was enough. At the time, police didn't release this discovery to the public. Instead, they quietly sent the DNA for advanced analysis. Traditional searches in CODIS, the National DNA Database, came back with no match. Whoever had left that trace wasn't in the system. For a while, it seemed like another dead end. Then investigators turned to a new tool, forensic genealogy. The method, made famous in solving cases like the Golden State Killer, uses consumer DNA databases to build family trees around unidentified suspects. By late December 2022, genealogists working with the FBI had built a profile that pointed toward a specific family in Pennsylvania. One name stood out, Bryan Kohberger. Kohberger, 28 at the time, was a criminology PhD student at Washington State University in Pullman, just 10 miles from Moscow. He drove a white Hyundai Elantra, a vehicle that police had already been looking for after spotting it on security footage near the crime scene around the time of the murders. Suddenly, the DNA from the knife sheath and the Elantra sightings converged on the same man. Still, investigators needed confirmation. In late December, they began surveillance on Kohberger in Pennsylvania, where he had traveled to spend the holidays with his family. While he was there, officers collected trash from outside the Kohberger residence. Testing showed that DNA from Bryan's father matched the profile connected to the knife sheath with a probability so strong it was nearly impossible to dismiss. The net was closing in. The sheath left behind in the King Road house had given detectives what weeks of interviews, speculation, and rumor could not. A name. But investigators weren't done. To make the case airtight, they needed more: cell phone records, surveillance, and evidence that tied Bryan Kohberger's movements to Moscow on the night of November 12th to 13th, 2022. And as they pieced together that trail, the walls around Kohberger began to close. Do you think it was careless for Bryan Kohberger to leave the knife sheath behind? Or was it inevitable that DNA evidence would eventually lead investigators to him? The DNA from the knife sheath had given investigators a name: Bryan Kohberger. But in a case of this magnitude, DNA alone wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed to prove beyond doubt that Kohberger wasn't just connected to the crime scene. He had been there, at the exact time 4 University of Idaho students were murdered. That proof came from something almost everyone carries every day: a cell phone. Investigators subpoenaed records from Kohberger's phone, examining its location data in the hours before and after the murders. What they found painted a chilling picture. On the night of November 12, 2022, Bryan Kohberger's phone was active near his apartment in Pullman, Washington, about 10 miles from Moscow. But curiously, at 2:47 a.m., the phone stopped transmitting data. For more than 2 hours, it appeared to go dark. No pings, no calls, no texts. Investigators believe he may have turned it off or put it in airplane mode. At the same time, a white Hyundai Elantra, later confirmed to be Kohberger's, was captured on multiple surveillance cameras driving toward Moscow. Security footage showed it circling the neighborhood around King Road multiple times between 3:29 and 4:20 a.m., as if the driver was waiting for the right moment. By 4:25 a.m., the car was seen speeding away from the area, heading back toward Pullman. Minutes later, Bryan's phone came back online. The timing was damning. The device reconnected to the network just as investigators believed the murders had concluded. But the digital trail didn't end there. Cell tower records placed Kohberger's phone near the King Road house on at least 12 separate occasions before November 13th. Most of those pings occurred late at night or in the early morning hours. Detectives argued this was evidence of stalking, that Kohberger had been surveilling the victims and studying their routines. Combined with eyewitness accounts, the case grew stronger. One surviving roommate told police she saw a figure dressed in black, wearing a mask with bushy eyebrows, walking past her bedroom toward the back sliding door around 4 a.m. That description aligned with Kohberger's appearance. Investigators also noted Kohberger's peculiar behavior after the murders. Surveillance cameras in Pullman captured his Elantra parked outside his apartment as if nothing had happened. Weeks later, when he drove across the country with his father to Pennsylvania, police followed closely behind. Dashcam video from Indiana troopers showed him nervous, glancing at his father during a routine traffic stop. By then, law enforcement already suspected him. Together, the DNA from the knife sheath, the surveillance footage of the Elantra, and the cell phone data created a narrative too strong to ignore. Still, questions remained. Why would a criminology student, someone who studied criminal behavior, leave such a digital trail? Did he underestimate investigators? Or was he arrogant enough to believe he couldn't be caught? Whatever the reason, the evidence was mounting. And by late December, detectives knew it was time to act. The man who had eluded capture for 6 weeks was about to face the knock on his door. Do you think Bryan Kohberger's mistakes, turning off his phone, circling the crime scene in his Elantra, were signs of arrogance or simple human error that exposed him? By the time detectives began circling in on Bryan Kohberger, he was not some drifter or faceless predator. He was a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology at Washington State University, Pullman, less than 10 miles from Moscow, Idaho, where 4 students had been murdered in their off-campus home. To his classmates, Kohberger was quiet but intense. Some described him as socially awkward, while others remembered a man who loved to argue in class, pressing professors with challenging questions. He seemed fascinated by the criminal mind, not just in theory but in practice. Originally from Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, Kohberger had studied psychology and criminal justice before moving west. He earned a master's degree in criminology at DeSales University, where he worked under Professor Catherine Ramsland, an expert who had written extensively about serial killers. Former peers recalled that he sometimes came across as arrogant, correcting classmates and dominating discussions about crime and punishment. But what disturbed many was his research project conducted months before the murders. On Reddit, using his own name, Kohberger posted a survey for ex-convicts. The questions asked about their thoughts and feelings during the commission of crimes. What did you think while committing the crime? How did you plan? How did you escape? How did you feel after? To investigators, those questions took on a chilling resonance in hindsight. Neighbors and acquaintances back in Pennsylvania remembered Kohberger as a man who had undergone a dramatic physical transformation. Once overweight, he lost a significant amount of weight during high school, adopting a rigid diet and exercise routine. But along with the change came a personality shift. Some recalled him becoming controlling, irritable, even cruel. He worked briefly as a security guard, and some coworkers remembered him as cold and detached. At Washington State University, he lived alone in a modest apartment and drove a white Hyundai Elantra, the same model seen near 1122 King Road at the time of the killings. Professors later said he had been a strong student academically, but his demeanor raised eyebrows. One professor noted that Kohberger sometimes seemed to view criminal behavior not as something to be condemned, but as something to be analyzed clinically, almost admired for its complexity. After the murders, classmates said his behavior changed. He grew quieter, more distracted, sometimes showing up to class looking exhausted. A few noticed scratches on his hands, though they were never confirmed as connected to the killings. The irony was unbearable. A man who had devoted his life to studying criminal behavior was now suspected of committing one of the most brutal crimes in Idaho's history. Investigators pored over his academic writings and online postings, searching for clues. They found no confession, no manifesto. But what they did find was a man obsessed with understanding how criminals think, act, and evade capture. And yet, despite all his study, Bryan Kohberger had left behind DNA, cell phone data, and a digital trail that pointed straight to him. By December 2022, authorities felt they had enough. The next step would not take place in a classroom or laboratory, but in the real world, where the suspect was about to be taken down. Do you think Bryan Kohberger's academic obsession with criminology fueled his crimes? Or was it simply the path of someone already destined for violence? For nearly 7 weeks after the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, fear gripped Moscow, Idaho. Students left campus early, parents kept calling police for updates, and rumors flooded social media. Then, just before the year ended, authorities made their move. On the morning of December 30th, 2022, police stormed a quiet neighborhood in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. At around 1:30 a.m., tactical teams surrounded the Kohberger family home. Inside, Bryan Kohberger was staying with his parents, having driven cross-country from Washington in his white Hyundai Elantra just days earlier. Neighbors later described the scene as surreal. Floodlights cutting through the darkness, officers in tactical gear shouting commands, and the sound of glass breaking as the front door was forced open. Moments later, Kohberger was led out in handcuffs, dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, his face pale under the harsh lights. It was a stunning development. For weeks, his name had been unknown to the public. Now, he was the prime suspect in one of the most high-profile murder cases in the country. Inside the Kohberger home, investigators seized multiple items: a computer tower, a mattress cover with possible bloodstains, and boxes of evidence. They towed away the Elantra that had been the subject of nationwide bulletins. Every detail of the raid was carefully documented, as prosecutors knew the defense would later scrutinize every move. Meanwhile, Bryan Kohberger sat in custody. His demeanor during the arrest was described as calm, even emotionless. He asked if anyone else had been arrested. When told no, he reportedly showed no reaction. Back in Idaho, the families of the victims were notified. For them, the arrest brought relief, but also renewed pain. The face of the man accused of killing their children was now everywhere, on news broadcasts in newspapers across the internet. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Within days, he agreed to be extradited to Idaho, where he would face trial. On January 4, 2023, a small plane carried him west. At the Pullman airport, shackled and escorted by heavily armed officers, he stepped onto Idaho soil to face the accusations. In Moscow, the community breathed a sigh of relief. The fear of an unknown killer had lifted, replaced by the grim reality of a named suspect. For investigators, however, the work was far from over. They had made an arrest, but now came the harder part: building a case airtight enough to withstand a courtroom battle. Kohberger's arrest ended one chapter, but it opened another: the slow, painful process of seeking justice through the courts. Do you think Bryan Kohberger's calm demeanor during his arrest was a sign of arrogance, or was it simply shock at being caught? The arrest was only the beginning. To follow every detail of how the case unfolded from the courtroom to sentencing, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. When Bryan Kohberger stepped into an Idaho courtroom for the first time in January 2023, the world was watching. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, dressed in an orange jail jumpsuit, his arrival marked a dramatic shift in the case of the University of Idaho for Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. The courtroom was tense, every seat filled with reporters, law enforcement officials, and grieving family members. On one side sat Kohberger, expressionless, his eyes darting briefly toward the judge before settling on the table in front of him. On the other sat the parents of the victims, clutching photographs of the children they had lost. The charges were read aloud: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Each charge carried the possibility of the death penalty. The prosecutor, visibly composed yet firm, stated that the state believed the evidence was strong enough to proceed on all counts. Kohberger's response was simple. He did not enter a plea. Instead, he stood silently as the judge informed him of his rights and set future court dates. His attorneys requested a delay in formal proceedings to allow more time for review of the evidence. The request was granted. For the families of the victims, the moment was gut-wrenching. Sitting in the gallery, they heard the names of their loved ones spoken in the cold language of legal proceedings. For Steve and Christy Goncalves, Kaylee's parents, it was another reminder of what had been stolen from them. For Stacy Chapin, Ethan's mother, it was an unimaginable burden to face the man accused of killing her son. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured raw emotion. Family members spoke to the media, some breaking down in tears, others summoning courage to demand justice. "We will be here for every hearing, every day," one parent declared. "We owe that to our children." The community of Moscow rallied around them. Vigils continued, candles flickering in the cold winter air. Students returned to campus, but the shadow of King Road lingered. Safety measures were increased, and the once carefree college town now lived under a cloud of grief and vigilance. Inside the courthouse, prosecutors revealed more of their case. DNA from the knife sheath, cell phone records showing Kohberger near the King Road house, and surveillance footage of his white Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood. The defense pushed back, arguing that evidence could be circumstantial, that DNA transfer was possible, and that the state's narrative left questions unanswered. The judge ordered Kohberger to remain in custody without bail. His next hearing was set, and the slow march toward trial had officially begun. For the victims' families, justice seemed both close and unbearably far. They could see the man accused, hear the charges, but the trial itself was months, perhaps years, away. And in the meantime, the question that haunted everyone remained unanswered. Why? Do you think Bryan Kohberger's silence in court was part of a calculated legal strategy? Or does it reveal something deeper about his state of mind? In the weeks following Bryan Kohberger's first court appearances, the legal system slowed to its usual pace. Hearings, motions, scheduling orders. But outside the courthouse, grief was anything but procedural. The families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Chapin were living what no parent should ever endure: burying their children. Funeral services were held across Idaho and Washington, each one a reminder of the lives stolen in a single night. At Madison Mogen's service, friends spoke about her bright spirit, her laughter, and her closeness with Kaylee Goncalves. They had grown up together, shared everything, and died together. Photos projected on church walls showed Maddie's smile, her energy, her life frozen in time. For Kaylee, her family spoke not only of their heartbreak, but also their anger. Her father, Steve Goncalves, stood before mourners and vowed to fight for answers. "My daughter's life was stolen, and I will not rest until we know why." His voice, raw with grief, echoed the frustration many felt, the lingering mystery of motive. Xana Kernodle's memorial was filled with laughter through tears. Friends remembered her fiery personality, her loyalty, her humor. One classmate recalled how Xana always stood up for others, even in small ways. Her family described her as a light that had been dimmed far too soon. For Chapin, a triplet, the loss was especially cruel. His siblings, Hunter and Maisie, spoke of the bond the three shared, a connection that made them inseparable from birth. Ethan's funeral was packed with friends and fraternity brothers from Sigma Chi, who described him as kind, easygoing, and always smiling. In Moscow itself, grief spilled into public spaces. A makeshift memorial outside the University of Idaho grew daily. Flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes piled higher as winter snow began to fall. At candlelight vigils, thousands gathered, holding each other as they whispered prayers into the cold night air. But healing was complicated by fear. Students, once carefree, now double-locked their doors and carried pepper spray. Some withdrew from the semester, unable to focus in classrooms overshadowed by loss. Professors adjusted coursework, understanding that trauma lingered in every lecture hall. The murders had not only taken 4 lives, they had stolen a sense of safety from an entire community. Still, in the face of tragedy, resilience began to show. Scholarships were created in the victims' names. Fundraisers supported grieving families. The message was clear. Moscow would not forget Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. Yet even as the town mourned, the trial loomed. Investigators were still building their case, and prosecutors prepared to present a mountain of evidence. The defense signaled it would fight every step, questioning DNA methods, cell phone records, and police procedures. For the families, the grief of funerals quickly gave way to the grind of hearings. They knew the road to justice would be long, painful, and public. And as the community clung to memories of the 4 young lives lost, the courtroom prepared to revisit every detail of the night that took them. Do you believe the community's strength in remembering the victims helps push justice forward? Or does the constant public attention risk deepening the family's pain? As the months passed after Bryan Kohberger's arrest, the case shifted from breaking news to the slow churn of pretrial hearings. For the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Chapin, each court date meant revisiting details of the night their children were taken. For prosecutors, it meant defending their evidence against an aggressive defense determined to pick it apart piece by piece. The state's case rested heavily on three pillars: the DNA on the knife sheath, the cell phone records, and the surveillance footage of the white Hyundai Elantra. Together, they painted a picture of Kohberger stalking the King Roadhouse and carrying out the murders. But the defense saw weaknesses they could exploit. First came the DNA. The defense team argued that the sample found on the knife sheath was only a single trace, not a full profile, and therefore could have been transferred indirectly. They suggested contamination was possible, raising questions about whether investigators had handled the crime scene carefully enough. Prosecutors countered with the forensic genealogy that had identified Kohberger's family, and the near-perfect match obtained later from his father's discarded trash. Still, the defense insisted jurors needed to consider the possibility of error. Next was the cell phone data. Prosecutors pointed out that Kohberger's phone had been dark for more than 2 hours during the murders. A suspicious gap. When it reconnected, it pinged towers near the crime scene. But the defense countered that cell tower data was not GPS and could not place him inside the house. They suggested that the gaps could have been caused by poor reception or even technical error, not intentional deactivation. The Hyundai Elantra footage became another battleground. Prosecutors showed stills of a car circling the neighborhood, its headlights cutting through the night. They argued it was consistent with Kohberger's vehicle and matched his registered car. The defense pushed back, saying there were thousands of Elantras on the road and that grainy footage couldn't definitively prove it was his. For the families sitting in the gallery, these debates were agonizing. To them, every detail confirmed what they already believed, that Bryan Kohberger had murdered their children. But in the courtroom, every assumption had to be tested, every piece of evidence challenged. Outside, the public debate mirrored the legal one. Online forums buzzed with arguments about DNA reliability, cell phone triangulation, and the interpretation of blurry surveillance images. Supporters of the families demanded conviction. Skeptics insisted the case had holes. The judge, tasked with balancing transparency and fairness, allowed much of the evidence to move forward but warned prosecutors that the defense's challenges would resonate with the jury. As the hearings stretched on, one reality became clear: the trial would not be quick. It would be long, painful, and technical, with both sides prepared to fight every inch. And as the defense mounted its arguments, another question loomed larger. Would prosecutors seek the death penalty or settle for life in prison if Kohberger was convicted? Do you think the defense's challenges to DNA and cell phone evidence raise real doubts? Or are they simply strategies to complicate an overwhelming case? As the pretrial hearings unfolded in Latah County, Idaho, one question hovered over the entire case. If convicted, should Bryan Kohberger face the death penalty? For prosecutors, the choice carried enormous weight. Idaho law allowed them to pursue capital punishment in cases of aggravated first-degree murder. For young lives, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Chapin had been brutally taken in their sleep. Few crimes seemed more suited for the harshest penalty the state could impose. At hearings, prosecutors made their position clear. They filed official notice of intent to seek the death penalty, arguing that the murders were especially heinous, that they involved multiple victims, and that they terrorized not only the victims but an entire community. The filing electrified the courtroom. For some, it was justice. For others, it was a grim reminder of the stakes. The families of the victims were divided. Some parents wanted nothing less than death, believing it was the only punishment fitting for the man accused of slaughtering their children. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, said publicly that no amount of prison time could equal the pain inflicted. Others, while equally devastated, feared a death penalty trial would drag on for decades with appeals, forcing them to relive the trauma again and again. Defense attorneys seized on this tension. They argued that pursuing the death penalty would bias jurors and make a fair trial nearly impossible. They cited Kohberger's right to due process and warned that the case could collapse under the weight of constitutional challenges. Behind closed doors, they pressed prosecutors to consider alternatives. Meanwhile, the community of Moscow watched anxiously. Vigils and rallies called for justice, but opinions were split. Some students and residents supported capital punishment. Others questioned whether executing Kohberger would bring closure or simply prolong the pain. The debate dragged on for months, a battle not just of law but of philosophy and morality. Prosecutors continued to build their case, knowing they would have to prove aggravating factors beyond the murders themselves. The defense pushed for exclusion of certain evidence, hoping to weaken the foundation of a death penalty claim. Ultimately, the decision loomed over every courtroom proceeding. Would justice mean life without parole, or death by lethal injection? For the families, the uncertainty was excruciating. They were already navigating grief, media scrutiny, and legal complexity. Now, they also carried the burden of imagining what justice would even look like in the end. As the state pushed forward, it became clear that the trial of Bryan Kohberger would not only determine his fate, but also test Idaho's appetite for its most severe punishment. Do you think prosecutors were right to pursue the death penalty, or would life without parole have been the more just path? For this case, the decision to seek death changed everything about the case. To see how this battle shaped the plea negotiations and ultimately Bryan Kohberger's fate, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss anything on this channel. As the legal clock ticked toward trial, whispers of a deal began to surface. For months, prosecutors in Idaho had prepared to pursue the death penalty against Bryan Kohberger, the man accused of murdering Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves Xana Kernodle, and Chapin. But behind the scenes, the realities of such a case weighed heavily. Death penalty trials are long, grueling, and uncertain. Even with strong evidence, the risk of appeals dragging on for decades loomed over the families. Prosecutors met with them privately, explaining the options: seek execution and endure years of hearings, accept life without parole, and ensure Bryan Kohberger would never walk free again. It was not an easy choice. Some families pushed for death, believing anything less would dishonor the lives lost. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, voiced his anger publicly, saying the system owed the harshest punishment. But others quietly acknowledged the cost of endless litigation. For them, closure mattered more than watching appeals unfold for the rest of their lives. The defense saw an opening. Kohberger's attorneys approached the prosecution with a proposal. Bryan would plead guilty to all charges if the state took the death penalty off the table. It was a strategic move designed to save his life while sparing the community a drawn-out trial. Negotiations stretched on for weeks. Prosecutors weighed the strength of their case against the risks of a jury trial. The DNA, cell phone data, and surveillance were compelling, but defense attorneys had already begun crafting doubts. A guilty plea, they reasoned, guaranteed accountability without the uncertainty of trial. In July 2025, the decision was finalized. Bryan Kohberger stood before the court, dressed in standard jail attire, flanked by his lawyers. In a steady voice, he admitted guilt on all 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The courtroom was silent. Families clutched photos of their children. Some wept openly. Others stared at Kohberger with anger, waiting for answers he refused to give. When the judge asked him if he wished to explain his actions, Kohberger declined. No motive, no justification, just silence. For prosecutors, the plea ensured 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus additional years for burglary. For the defense, it was survival, their client spared from execution. For the families, it was something more complicated. Relief that the case was over, mixed with rage that the man responsible still refused to reveal why. The plea deal avoided the spectacle of trial, but it left a haunting gap. The nation knew who, how, and when, but the question of why Bryan Kohberger killed 4 young students remained unanswered. Do you think prosecutors made the right decision accepting a plea deal, or should they have pursued the death penalty even if it meant years of appeals? On July 23, 2025, the Latah County courtroom was filled to capacity. The trial that never happened had ended with a guilty plea. But now came the moment for the judge to decide Bryan Kohberger's fate. Families of the victims, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Chapin, packed the benches alongside reporters, students, and community members who had followed the case since the day of the murders. Bryan Kohberger entered in shackles, wearing a plain orange jumpsuit. He looked thinner, paler than in the days of his arrest, but his expression remained unchanged. He glanced briefly at the families seated behind him before turning his eyes back toward the judge. Before sentencing, the court allowed family members to deliver victim impact statements. It was their moment, the chance to speak directly to the man who had shattered their lives. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, stepped forward first. His voice trembled with anger. "You took my daughter, my baby girl, and her best friend. You left us with nothing but questions. You've given us no why, no explanation, and yet here you sit, still breathing, while our children lie in the ground." Madison Mogen's mother spoke next, her voice breaking. She described Madison's smile, her laughter, her plans for the future. She was everything a mother could want in a daughter. You stole that, and you gave nothing back. Not even the decency of an apology. For Xana Kernodle's family, the pain was almost unbearable. Her sister sobbed as she spoke, recalling their childhood, their bond, the dreams Xana would never fulfill. Chapin's parents, who had lost not only a son but a triplet, described a wound that would never heal. "Hunter and Maisie will carry this hole with them for the rest of their lives," his mother said. "We all will." The courtroom was silent except for tears. Even seasoned reporters admitted to choking up as the families bared their grief. When it was his turn, Bryan Kohberger stood. Asked if he wished to address the court, he declined. No apology, no explanation. His silence cut deeper than words. Finally, Judge John Judge delivered the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for each of the 4 murders, to be served consecutively, plus 10 additional years for burglary. Kohberger showed no visible reaction. The families embraced one another, tears streaming, knowing the legal battle was over but their grief would never be. The man accused was condemned to spend his life behind bars. Yet the unanswered question, why, lingered like a shadow over the entire proceeding. As Kohberger was led away, his chains rattling softly, the families stared after him. For some, there was relief. For others, only frustration. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law. But the truth about motive, about the darkness inside Bryan Kohberger, remained hidden. And that silence would haunt them forever. Do you believe Bryan Kohberger's refusal to speak at sentencing was an act of defiance? Or proof that there was never a clear motive to begin with? The sound of the judge's gavel on July 23, 2025, echoed long after the courtroom emptied. Bryan Kohberger had been sentenced to life without parole for the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Chapin, but the family's grief and the nation's fascination with the case did not end there. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, their cameras capturing every tear, every statement, every silent embrace between family members. For the first time in nearly 3 years, the legal battle was over. Yet the media frenzy was just beginning. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, stepped forward to address the press. His voice carried the same fire he had shown throughout the case. This sentence locks him away, but it doesn't give us answers. We'll never stop asking why. We'll never stop speaking Kaylee's name. His words struck a chord with families across the country who had followed the case from its earliest days. Madison Mogen's family, still clutching a framed photo of her, called the sentencing a step toward closure, but admitted it did little to heal the wound. "We will always wonder what Maddie's life could have been," her mother said quietly, her voice breaking as she walked away from the cameras. For Xana Kernodle's relatives, the pain was raw. Her sister told reporters, "Justice in a courtroom doesn't erase the horror of that night. It doesn't bring Xana back. It doesn't bring Ethan back. Nothing ever will." Chapin's parents, speaking alongside his triplet siblings, described the sentence as necessary but insufficient. We are grateful for the prosecutors, for the community, for everyone who stood with us. But our home will always be missing Ethan. That emptiness never leaves. National networks carried these statements live. Commentators dissected every word, every gesture, as if searching for deeper meaning. Social media erupted with debates over justice, motive, and the unresolved mysteries of the case. Meanwhile, the press turned its attention to Bryan Kohberger's silence. Why had he refused to explain his actions? Did he believe speaking would weaken future appeals? Or was the absence of a motive itself the most chilling truth? Experts weighed in, but no one could fill the void left by his refusal. For the community of Moscow, the sentencing marked the end of a long chapter. Students and faculty at the University of Idaho gathered at a campus vigil the night after sentencing, lighting candles in memory of the 4 lives lost. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, but also with determination. They would not let fear define their town. Yet, as the crowds dispersed and cameras packed up, the lingering question remained. Why? The world had a conviction, a sentence, and an answer to who. But the question of why Bryan Kohberger murdered 4 students in their sleep had never been answered. And for many, it never would. Do you think Bryan Kohberger's silence about motive will keep this case alive in public memory for decades? Or will people eventually accept that some answers may never come? The sentencing of Bryan Kohberger did not close the book on the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. If anything, it opened new chapters in the media, in public debate, and in the way the case was etched into America's collective memory. Within hours of the judge's decision, networks launched wall-to-wall coverage. True crime documentaries were announced, podcasts promised deep dives, and television specials replayed every moment from the crime scene to the courthouse. The faces of the 4 victims, once ordinary college students, became enduring symbols of a nightmare that had begun in a quiet Idaho town. For many Americans, the case crystallized an unsettling truth. Violence can strike anywhere, even in the places we believe are safest. The University of Idaho, once known for its tight-knit community and picturesque campus, became synonymous with fear and loss. Parents across the country asked themselves if their children were truly safe away at school. But beyond the fear, the case carried a mystery that gripped the public imagination. Why did Bryan Kohberger do it? Why target Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan? Investigators had built a case strong enough to secure a conviction, yet motive remained elusive. Without an answer, speculation flourished. Was it obsession, academic curiosity, anger at rejection, or something darker, beyond comprehension? Commentators called it a modern echo of cases like Ted Bundy, a man educated in criminology, seemingly fascinated by crime, who crossed the line from theory to brutal reality. Experts debated whether Kohberger's studies fueled his crimes or whether they were simply an outlet for impulses he already carried. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continued their advocacy. They gave interviews, reminding the public not to reduce their children to case studies. Remember their laughter, their dreams, one parent said. They were more than a headline. Memorial scholarships were launched in each of the victims' names, turning grief into opportunity for future students. The case also sparked wider conversations about forensic genealogy, digital surveillance, and the role of technology in solving crimes. It became a textbook example in criminal justice classrooms, ironically the very field Bryan Kohberger once studied. But amid all the analysis, one fact remained. The 4 young lives lost at 1122 King Road could never be replaced. Their absence was felt in classrooms, at family dinners, and in the empty rooms of a house that had become infamous. Do you believe the unanswered question of motive is what makes this case unforgettable? Or is it the sheer brutality of the crime itself that keeps it in the public eye? The story of the Idaho 4 doesn't end with headlines or documentaries. To honor Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, and to follow the lasting impact of their story, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. With Bryan Kohberger sentenced to life in prison, the courtroom battles gave way to a different fight. The fight to make sure the names of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were never forgotten. For the families, justice was only part of the story. The greater mission became remembrance. At the University of Idaho, a memorial garden was proposed, a place where students could gather to reflect, grieve, and remember the 4 lives cut short on November 13, 2022. The idea quickly gained support. Donations poured in from across the country, many accompanied by handwritten notes from strangers who had followed the case and felt connected to the victims' stories. Each family also launched their own initiatives. The Mogen family established a scholarship fund in Madison's name, aimed at supporting students in the College of Business and Economics. She was studying marketing and dreamed of a career where she could combine creativity and strategy. Her mother explained, "We want other students to finish the journey Maddie couldn't." The Goncalves family became fierce advocates for campus safety, pressing for better security measures, improved communication between universities and law enforcement, and more resources for students living off campus. They also honored Kaylee's love of animals by supporting shelters in her memory. For the Kernodle family, the focus was on celebrating Xana's energy and resilience. They created the Xana Kernodle Scholarship Endowment, dedicated to helping students from her hometown pursue higher education. "She loved life," her father said. "We want her joy to carry forward." The Chapin family, still navigating the grief of losing Ethan while watching his siblings Hunter and Maisie continue their studies, established the Ethan's Smile Foundation. Its mission, to support programs for children, particularly in recreation and sports, passions that Ethan had embodied. In interviews, the families spoke about the tension between grief and purpose. Each initiative was born from heartbreak, but also from determination. "We can't change what happened," one parent said, "but we can make sure their names live on in something good." Community members and students rallied behind these efforts. Candlelight vigils continued on anniversaries, with hundreds gathering to say the names aloud. Madison, Kaylee, Xana, Ethan. Murals went up in their hometowns. On social media, their stories were shared with hashtags like #Idaho4 and #JusticeForThe4, not to relive the crime, but to preserve the memory of who they were. Yet even as these tributes grew, the haunting silence from Kohberger remained. He had admitted guilt but given no explanation. And for the families, that unanswered question, why, remained the heaviest burden. As one parent put it, "We can keep their names alive, but we will never understand why they had to die." Do you think turning grief into advocacy and scholarships helps families heal? Or does it keep them tied to the pain of their loss? The murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin began as a local tragedy, but by the time Bryan Kohberger was sentenced, the case had transformed into something larger, a national conversation about safety, science, and trust. At universities across the country, administrators took notice. Students at the University of Idaho had returned to class in January 2023 carrying pepper spray, locking their dorms, and questioning whether they were truly safe. Other schools, watching from afar, responded by increasing campus security patrols, installing more cameras, and updating emergency communication systems. Safety, once an afterthought, became a priority. Parents, too, grew more vocal. Across the nation, they demanded clearer policies for off-campus housing and stronger partnerships between universities and local police. "We send our kids to school for an education," one parent said on national television, "not to wonder if they'll survive the night." But the Idaho 4 case also reshaped discussions in law enforcement circles, particularly around forensic genealogy. The use of consumer DNA databases to identify Kohberger through his family tree showed the power of modern science. What had once been a niche tool became a mainstream expectation. Cold cases from across the country were revisited, and agencies poured resources into building genealogical units. Still, the method sparked debates. Critics raised privacy concerns. Should the DNA you send to a company to learn about your ancestry be used to catch criminals in your family? Supporters argued the results spoke for themselves. Killers who once seemed untouchable were being identified and brought to justice. The Idaho case became a cornerstone example in these debates. The investigation also raised questions about law enforcement communication. Early on, Moscow police had described the murders as targeted, but then walked back the statement, creating confusion and mistrust. Families of the victims, especially the Goncalves family, were outspoken in criticizing the flow of information. "We were left in the dark," Steve Goncalves said, while the community panicked. For law enforcement agencies everywhere, the case became a cautionary tale. Transparency matters, but so does protecting the integrity of an investigation. For students of criminology, the irony was impossible to ignore. Bryan Kohberger had studied the very systems that eventually caught him. His downfall became a lecture topic in classrooms nationwide, a reminder that no amount of theory or education can outsmart the weight of evidence and science. In the end, the Idaho 4 case was more than just a crime story. It forced America to ask difficult questions. How do we keep students safe? How far should forensic science go? And how do we balance the public's demand for answers with the need to protect an investigation? Even after Kohberger's sentencing, these questions lingered. And for the families, no matter how many policies changed or technologies advanced, one question remained louder than all the rest. Why did he do it? Do you think the rise of forensic genealogy is worth the privacy trade-offs? Or should its use be limited despite its success in cases like this? Nearly 3 years after the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the town of Moscow, Idaho, still carries the weight of that November night. Bryan Kohberger is now serving life without parole, but the community that once called itself a safe college town remains forever changed. At the heart of this transformation stands a house, 1122 King Road, once a lively student rental, filled with music, laughter, and friends coming and going. It became a crime scene frozen in memory. For months after the murders, it sat behind police tape, guarded by patrol cars and watched by cameras. Reporters stood outside its doors, neighbors walked by in silence, and students avoided the street altogether. Eventually, the University of Idaho announced plans to demolish the house, calling it an act of healing. The decision was controversial. Some families supported it, believing the structure carried too much pain to remain standing. Others opposed it, worried that tearing it down would erase a vital part of the case's history. But as the bulldozers moved in, many residents admitted they felt a weight lift, even as the empty lot left behind became its own kind of memorial. For students, life on campus is split into 2 eras, before and after November 13, 2022. Safety drills are more common now, police patrols more visible. New security measures were added to off-campus housing, and the university continues to offer counseling for those struggling with trauma. But beneath these changes, unease lingers. "It's always there," one student said. "You walk home at night, and you think about them." The family's presence in Moscow also remains strong. They attend vigils, fundraisers, and memorials. Scholarships in each victim's name are awarded annually, ensuring that the 4 are remembered not for how they died but for who they were. Madison's ambition, Kaylee's adventurous spirit, Xana's joy, and Ethan's kindness live on through the students who benefit from these legacies. Still, the community cannot fully escape the tragedy. The case became a national spectacle, and Moscow's name is now tied to it forever. For many residents, the intrusion of cameras and strangers in those early months left scars almost as deep as the crime itself. "We lost our sense of peace," one longtime resident admitted. "We'll never get it back the way it was." Yet, amid the sorrow, resilience has taken root. Murals honor the victims, candles are lit each anniversary, and community events bring people together in remembrance. Moscow may never return to what it was, but it has built something new. A promise to honor 4 young lives and to ensure their loss is never in vain. But as the years stretch forward, one truth remains. While the town can move on, the families cannot. They live with an unhealed wound, carrying the names of their children like banners in a fight against forgetting. And with Bryan Kohberger locked away, one question echoes louder than ever. A question no trial, no sentence, no memorial can answer. Why? Do you believe demolishing the King Road house was the right step toward healing? Or should it have remained standing as a lasting memorial and reminder of the case? With Bryan Kohberger sentenced to life without parole, the legal story of the Idaho 4 is over. Yet for the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the fight for justice was never just about the courtroom. It was about honoring the lives their children lived and confronting the silence left behind. Kohberger never explained himself. Not at trial, not at sentencing, not once in the months since being locked away. That silence has become its own kind of cruelty, denying families the closure they longed for. For them, the question of why remains as sharp and painful as the day they first learned of the murders. But justice, imperfect as it may be, has given them one certainty. Bryan Kohberger will never harm another person again. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a prisoner of the very system he once studied. For Moscow, Idaho, the tragedy became both scar and symbol. The house at 1122 King Road is gone, but its memory endures in the faces of those who still gather each year to light candles and whisper the names of the 4 young lives lost. The University of Idaho continues to award scholarships in their honor, ensuring that students will carry Madison's ambition, Kaylee's courage, Xana's spirit, and Ethan's kindness into futures they themselves never got to live. Nationally, the case reshaped conversations about campus safety, law enforcement transparency, and forensic science. It showed both the fragility of safety and the resilience of communities when confronted with unimaginable violence. But perhaps its greatest impact is the reminder that behind every headline are real people, students who loved, laughed, and dreamed. As time passes, new tragedies will capture the spotlight, and the media will turn its gaze elsewhere. Yet for the families, for the friends who shared classrooms and late-night conversations with Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, the loss will never fade. They live in the echoes of memories that should have stretched decades further. Justice brought accountability, but it could never answer the question that still lingers in the silence Bryan Kohberger left behind. Why? Do you believe some crimes are destined to remain without motive? Or should the justice system demand answers even when killers refuse to speak? The story of the Idaho 4 reminds us that justice is not only about courts and convictions. It's about remembering the lives that were stolen. In memory of the Idaho 4, Madison Mogen 21, Kaylee Goncalves 21, Xana Kernodle 20, Ethan Chapin 20. On November 13, 2022, 4 vibrant lives were stolen in the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho. To the world, they became known as the Idaho 4, but to their families and friends, they were so much more. Madison Mogen was bright, loyal, and full of laughter, with dreams of building a career in marketing. Kaylee Goncalves was fearless and adventurous, ready to take on the next chapter of her life with her beloved dog, Murphy, at her side. Xana Kernodle was strong, joyful, and independent, remembered for her contagious laugh and loyal spirit. Ethan Chapin, a triplet, was kind-hearted and easygoing, a young man who brought warmth and joy to everyone who knew him. Their absence leaves a hole that can never be filled. Their futures were filled with promise, their friendships unbreakable, and their love for life undeniable. Though gone, they live on in the scholarships created in their names, in the hearts of their families, and in the community that refuses to forget. May Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan always be remembered not for how their lives ended, but for how beautifully they lived. Rest in peace. To help keep the memory of Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan alive, please like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Their voices deserve to echo long after the headlines fade.